Very rightly put by the ambassador. Professor, let me take those comments to you now. There's suddenly a lot of interest. The media is talking about it. Let's not forget the summit is just around the corner as well. So, one of the countries which is extremely interested is Algeria and is wanting to commit to about $1.5 billion as far as investments are concerned into the bank. So, is this coming as a surprise for you? Or do you feel that the oil rich countries see an opportunity here? And, with everything that's happening between Russia and Ukraine as well, so these countries seeing this as an opportunity.
I think let me first of all say thank you for having me on your program. Uh, Let me also begin by making an academic point first. Whether there is a need for any structural reforms in BRICS and whether that structural reforms have to be expansion that we are discussing. As recent as today, as we speak, the National Security Advisors of BRICS are meeting in Johannesburg today and tomorrow. And yesterday, the Foreign Minister of South Africa, Mr. Soklal, for the first time mentioned 40 countries as aspirant nations. Such large number has never been mentioned as aspirant nations trying to join BRICS. And he mentioned 40 countries and said about 20 of them have already formally applied to become members of BRICS. So point number one, there is enormous interest in joining BRICS, which for me clearly indicates to the increasing credibility of BRICS as a grouping, because there is enormous desire of several new countries trying to join BRICS. Second point is about the very imagination of BRICS. You remember Jim O'Neill in 2000 had spoken of emerging economies and identified four countries: Brazil, Russia, China, and India. Primarily saying G7 nations should think of investing in these economies because per dollar returns are going to be much better. Now, from that concept to 2006 first outreach of foreign ministers to 2009 first summit meeting, BRICS has come thus far. But we have noticed now that other than China and India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa hardly qualify to be called emerging economies. So there is definitely a need to revisit that concept. And one way of not thinking of exiting some of the countries which do not stand qualification of being emerging economies, a positive approach would be to add on new members. And then, of course, one looks at the criteria. For about 2.5 years, the Sherpas of BRICS have been discussing the standards, criterion, procedure, etc., as to how new members can be thought of. After all, it's about nearly 2 decades. If you look at from 2000, the imagination of BRICS, and of course 12, 13 years since they started having summit meetings, there is no addition other than South Africa, which was added in 2010 and 11. Now I mention South Africa because addition of South Africa was an aberration in itself. It was a very small economy of less than even today $500 billion, and it was explained as a gateway to Africa. And starting with that imagination of gateway to Africa, for the first time, BRICS Summit is going to have the largest outreach ever. President Ramaphosa is inviting all 55 heads of nations, including South Africa, so 54 heads of nations of all African continent. I don't know how many of them will join. So Africa is already now becoming the focus, and therefore several other nations, you mentioned Algeria, many others, Egypt also is similar 500 billion economy, just as South Africa is. So definitely there is technically need for structural reforms and expansion because there is so many countries willing to join. Third very quick point is the very combination that made BRICS to begin with has really become dislocated now. China alone today has a GDP 3 times than rest of the BRICS put together. India among these is the fastest growing economy. So these junctions between the members of BRICS today stand out. And China therefore has been the flag bearer almost now from 2008-7. Foreign Minister Wang Yi had started the concept of Friends of BRICS, BRICS Plus, which later evolved into BRICS Outreach Summit meetings. So there is a collection of countries that have been over time brought closer to BRICS in any case, not given formal membership as of now. Now, other than China, we notice now for 2 years, because of Ukraine war and isolation that Russia is facing, Russian president also is showing enormous interest in supporting expansion. For a long time, India was reluctant because India was not very clear whether China will push in a lot of China members. You would remember debates of 1950s and 60s when United Nations was expanding, UN Security Council was expanding. The fear in Soviet Union was whether America will bring in all its friends. And concern in America was whether Soviet Union is pushing their friends into UN Security Council. Same concern India has had. But now we notice that India in last 5 years is no longer the same that India was 5 years before that.
Absolutely.
And India has enormously built very strong partnerships with several countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Egypt, Indonesia. One can name several of them with which India now has a strong partnership and therefore feels at greater comfort in allowing them as new members. So I think fundamentally, as we speak now, today and tomorrow, this is on agenda as to what the Sherpas have brought about, certain kind of consensus on standards, procedures, etc., on how to take new members. This is going to be an important issue in this coming summit next month. And I see that on several names, India is becoming comfortable in allowing. And of course, Russia and China are most enthusiastic in expanding.
Right.
The reports are saying that maybe about 5 more countries will be added in this summit. So that's the mood that we notice now. How it will suit India, we can maybe discuss in the later half of discussion.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point that you made, Ambassador. And, Professor, I think this is something that we have seen in front of our own eyes with SCO, becoming probably the only organization which is named after a city like that, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and it clearly shows where the allegiance of the organization really lies. Are we at some level concerned? Should New Delhi be worried about BRICS taking on that kind of a color?
I think I fully agree with Ambassador on the fact that India has to be cautious. India has been indeed the most cautious of all the 5 countries in the BRICS. And that has been the reality so far. But apparently over a period of time, because all other 4 members are in consensus, and apparently China is the flag bearer and Russia is now also equally enthusiastic, India has over a period of time allowed this discussion to be there for the last 2.5 years. Sherpas, as I mentioned, are discussing it formally.
For the fear of being singled out, isn't it, Professor?
Partly. But also remember that India is at the same time, as Ambassador was alluding to, is member of Quad, for example, Quadrilateral Security Framework. India is always an invitee to the G7 summit meetings. And therefore, India has had this very complex balancing act of strategic autonomy, and that makes it clearly much more cautious of not putting all eggs in one basket, like the Russians particularly today are willing to promote BRICS as, if not anti, then definitely parallel or even alternative to the Western sort of global governance. And that is where you see also enormous talk about de-dollarization. And I would agree that if any grouping has the potential to think of putting up a parallel currency, if not to replace dollar, but at least create an alternative, BRICS will be clearly one. But that is an uphill task. We have seen European Union trying with euro and not succeeding because dollar is predominantly the currency of international trade and national foreign currency reserves. Even today, about 88% of global trade is in dollar. About 67% of national foreign exchange reserves are in dollar. So it's not easy, but the debate is interesting that, BRICS is talking of de-dollarization. To begin with, focusing at least on bilateral, if not their multilateral intra-BRICS trade, at least bilateral trade to become increasingly using local currencies. For example, they are focusing on that kind of initiative. And India is not really opposing it. India is also using a lot of local currency. For example, the enormous boom in Indo-Russian trade has been possible with all the difficulties in rupee trade, but that's one reason why it became possible to take it from $8-9 billion to $44 billion. So that is one important new element which is making India kind of appearing to be aligning better with BRICS. Second, and I think more important for India, traditionally being the flag bearer for multilateralism and free and open dialogue, which again is now increasingly the sense around the world that Western nations led by United Nations are becoming increasingly protectionist. And China is emerging as a flag bearer for free trade and things like these. And multilateralism and of course plurilateralism, where again you have a much more flexible way of organizing interactions and dialogue. India is a flag bearer of that, and BRICS is increasingly pushing that agenda as well, that we want to protect, promote and celebrate multilateralism. And third very significant point, I think India with growing GDP and growing the foreign trade is willing to find new partnerships wherever it can. Whether it is Eurasia, across Africa, for example, Prime Minister is promoting that African Union should be made 21st member of G20 in the coming summit meeting in September in New Delhi. So India is also increasingly engaging with African nations, and by extension, that would indicate, allude to the global South. India also is emerging and is trying to emerge as a voice for global South. And you remember Prime Minister had Global South Summit in January. And that is where India also wants to see itself seriously engaged in BRICS groupings, which is promoting some of these issues and ideas, where India finds itself useful player and of course beneficiary of those kind of changes. And finally, of course, in ensuring that it does not wish to belong to either of the two kind of emerging groupings of nations, Russia, China and its friends on one side, United States and European allies on the other side. There is a talk of some kind of divide emerging, and India doesn't want to be part of the either side, and therefore its continued engagement with BRICS in principle also reinforces and in that sense vindicates the desire to ensure strategic autonomy. But as I said, India is very cautious, remains cautious, and is very interested in ensuring that it doesn't give a free hand to either China, particularly China, but even to Russia, to pick and choose kind of members that they want to bring in. And that is their last 2.5 years of serious discussions at Sherpa levels in setting criterion, standards, procedures as to how new members will be picked up. And I believe that new members are definitely going to come about in this summit meeting. Now, the procedure may take a couple of more months, years. We don't know how much time that will take to fulfill those details of getting them formally on board. But in principle, I think some new members, and we are reading about 5 members, are likely to be joining BRICS, making it a group of 10 countries. And I think India is preparing to deal with that reality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Professor, please close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Thank you. Let me again end with an academic point. 19th century global governance was dominated by major European colonial powers using military alliances, naval bases. 20th century, after 2 world wars, we ended up thinking of institutionalizing international organizations. We have about 600 plus of them now, having structures, conventions, secretariats. 21st century is about plurilateralism. That is simply because leaders, national leaders and their political elites, advisors, ministers, officials are able to deliver such a hyperactive diplomatic footwork like never before. And therefore, plurilateralism is what suits today, with very large overarching agenda which combines large number of countries together, but flexibility of silos, of subgroups, which can focus on specifics and specific memberships to move that way, in that muddling through model rather than in a very structuralized legal institutional model. Now add to that rapid pace, India's own rapid growth, India's own rapid expansion of global engagement. So for India, the hyperaction is indeed, double, because global change and India's change is merging together. And therefore, I think BRICS, to close my final point, is a representative of that kind of loose-ended plurilateral grouping, which is still in the making. And there is a lot of flexibility that exists within as to how they operate. Originally, with an economic mandate, they have now moved into cyber security, into women empowerment, and all kind of other issues. All kind of debates take place among these members now. And I think, therefore, even from academic point of view, one would think BRICS is a grouping for the future. Now, how effective they will be, how cohesive they will be, how useful they will be for India, we can go on debating them. But I think here is a grouping that India has to really find certain amount of engagement maintained, of course, ensuring strategic autonomy and not putting all eggs in one basket. India is not doing that, and I assume that India's cautious approach in engaging BRICS will continue, and BRICS will definitely expand, and it will expand the way India would like to see it expand.
Absolutely.